There's something about an old bar at the edge of downtown. Dim lights, dusty shelves of bourbon, the low hum of classic rock curling through the air like smoke. It's the kind of place where time slows down, where nobody asks questions, and strangers become background noise. But on this particular night, in this particular bar, something unforgettable was about to unfold, something no one in that room would ever forget. And it all started with a man sitting alone in the corner. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he looked like the kind of man who had seen enough of it for 3 lifetimes. Broad shoulders relaxed beneath a soft charcoal sweater, head slightly. He bowed over a glass of whiskey. His presence didn't scream for attention, but it demanded respect. That man was Dwayne Johnson, 53 years old, calm, centered, and with a quiet intensity that turned silence into a warning. He didn't come here to be a hero. He came for a quiet drink, to fade into the rhythm of bar chatter and forget the noise of the outside world. But fate, it seems, had a different plan, because at another table, not far from the bar's glowing counter, something ugly was brewing. Greg. That was his name, a hulking man with a voice as loud as his ego, pushing boundaries, laughing just a little too hard, just a little too aggressively. He wasn't drunk. No, this was his usual, his comfort zone. Greg thrived on fear. And tonight, his target was a smaller man, seated a few stools down. Eric, quiet, slight, the kind of guy who just wanted to enjoy a drink without drawing attention. But Greg had other plans. "Look at this guy," Greg barked, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Sitting here all alone. What, no friends? No gym membership either, huh?" His friends laughed, egging him on, while Eric tried to disappear into his glass. The room shifted. The laughter around them died down. Conversations faltered. People noticed, but no one said a word. Just like always, except for one man. Dwayne sat still, unmoving, watching everything unfold. His eyes, sharp, knowing, tracked Greg's every motion. He recognized the pattern. He'd seen it in locker rooms, in back alleys, on film sets, and battlefields. Bullies came in all shapes, but they always wanted the same thing, control. And they always pushed, until someone pushed back. But the question wasn't if Dwayne would act. It was when, what no one realized as they sipped their drinks and stole uncomfortable glances, was that they were about to witness something extraordinary, something they would talk about for years. Because sometimes, it only takes one person to change the entire temperature of a room, and tonight, that person was sitting in the shadows, sipping whiskey, waiting, and watching. The low murmur of conversation barely covered the tension creeping through the bar. Greg was in his element now, towering over his table, shirt sleeves stretched around his swollen biceps. He thrived on attention, and he was getting it. Not applause, not admiration, but something subtler, eyes darting in his direction, uncomfortable glances, lowered voices. He was the kind of man who mistook fear for respect. And Eric, he was doing what most people do in moments like this, hoping it would all blow over. He gripped his glass tighter, lips pressed together, eyes fixed downward. Maybe if he ignored the taunts, if he didn't flinch, Greg would get bored. But bullies like Greg didn't get bored. They escalated, and now he was leaning in closer, that smug grin stretching wide across his face like a challenge. "Come on, man," Greg sneered, loud enough for half the bar to hear. "Say something, or are you too scared?" He slapped the table with an open hand, sharp, deliberate. The sound echoed across the room, rattling the ice in Eric's glass. A few heads turned, but none of them moved. A couple sitting near the jukebox whispered nervously. Another man shifted uncomfortably, then looked away. No one wanted to be the first to intervene. Greg grabbed Eric's drink and sniffed it mockingly. "What is this? A kid's drink?" he said, taking a sip with exaggerated disgust. "No wonder you look like that." His laughter erupted again, joined by a few hesitant chuckles from his friends, though even they were starting to feel uneasy. They weren't laughing as loudly now. Something had shifted, and still Dwayne sat quietly. His chair hadn't moved. His drink remained half full. But his eyes, calm and deliberate, were fixed on Greg like a hawk circling high above. He'd seen enough to understand what this was. Greg wasn't just being rude. He was trying to dominate, to humiliate. And Eric, despite trying to disappear into himself, wasn't going to get out of this alone. Dwayne could feel the slow burning fuse of the moment inching closer to something no one wanted to see. He knew the crowd wouldn't act. That was the sad truth of situations like these. People watched, they whispered, they hoped someone else would step in. And while that might feel safe, it's how bullies like Greg got away with it over and over again. Dwayne didn't move yet. He waited. Not because he was unsure, but because he understood timing. Patience was a weapon, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not act until it matters most. Greg slammed Eric's glass back on the table, spilling the contents. His voice rose again. "You scared to look at me now? Huh?" His grin was wider now, drunk on the sound of his own cruelty. Eric's jaw clenched, and for a moment it seemed like he might respond. But he didn't. His silence only fueled Greg more. A few people in the bar exchanged worried glances. One woman near the far end looked toward the bartender, but he just kept wiping glasses, pretending not to see. The tension was building in a way that was hard to ignore. A storm was coming, and everyone felt it, but only one person was truly ready for it. Dwayne finally exhaled, a subtle breath through his nose. He set his glass down, slowly, deliberately. His fingertips lingered for a moment on the rim, then released. No drama, no raised voice, just a shift, like the stillness before a thunderclap. He stood, and the energy in the room changed instantly. The sound of Dwayne's chair scraping the floor was soft, almost unnoticeable, but the effect was instant. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. Even Greg's voice, which had been booming just moments earlier, wavered and trailed off. Dwayne didn't need to speak to announce his presence. He simply stood, and the atmosphere cracked like glass under pressure. With calm, unhurried steps, he began walking toward Greg's table. Not fast, not threatening, but with purpose. Like someone who had made a decision and wasn't about to explain himself. Greg was still mid-laugh when he noticed the man approaching. His amusement froze as his eyes landed on Dwayne. 6'5", 260 pounds of quiet power, walking straight toward him with that same unreadable expression. The room shifted with every step Dwayne took. The energy, the attention, the air itself, it all tilted in his direction. And yet, he didn't posture. He didn't puff up his chest or narrow his eyes like some wannabe tough guy. He just walked, like a man who didn't need to prove anything. Greg leaned back slightly, trying to mask the sudden stiffness in his posture. "Is there a problem here?" Dwayne asked, his voice low, calm, but it cut through the room like a knife. Every word landed with weight, not anger, not threat, just a simple question, but it demanded an answer. Greg chuckled awkwardly. "Who are you? The fun police?" he said, forcing bravado back into his voice. He nudged Eric again, harder this time. "We're just having a little fun, right?" But no one was laughing anymore, not even his friends. Dwayne didn't break eye contact. His gaze stayed locked on Greg. "That doesn't look like fun to me," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Looks like you're trying to feel big by making someone else feel small." Greg's smirk faltered. He looked to his friends for backup, but they weren't smiling either. The dynamic had changed, and they could feel it. There was something different about this man, something that couldn't be ignored. He tried to shrug it off. "And what if I am?" Greg said, leaning forward, trying to match Dwayne's presence. "You gonna do something about it?" Dwayne didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even tense. He just stood there, centered and unshakable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. And somehow that was worse for Greg, because the man in front of him wasn't angry. He was prepared, and that quiet, unbothered readiness was more intimidating than any threat could ever be. The silence between them was suffocating. The rest of the bar seemed to hold its breath, every eye locked on the standoff, unfolding at the center of the room. Greg was used to people backing down, laughing nervously, apologizing. But Dwayne wasn't giving him any of that. No fear, no submission, just stillness, and something behind his eyes, a quiet promise. You don't want to do this. And for the first time, Greg hesitated. The room had never been this quiet, not since it opened its doors decades ago. The low hum of the jukebox had faded into the background, swallowed by tension that wrapped itself around every corner of the bar. No glasses clinked, no conversations resumed. All eyes were fixed on the two men standing face to face, one boiling with bravado, the other calm as stone. Greg's bravado was cracking, even if he refused to show it. His smirk came back, thinner now, forced at the edges. He squared his shoulders, trying to look taller, tougher, more in control. But something in his posture betrayed him. A slight shift, a twitch at the jaw, a flicker of doubt. It was fleeting, but Dwayne saw it. "You sure you want to keep going?" Dwayne asked, his voice still soft, almost too soft, but that only made it scarier. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, and it sounded more like a lifeline than a challenge. Greg let out a scoff, loud and jagged. "You think I'm scared?" "Of you?" he said, puffing out his chest. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, trying to find any crack in Dwayne's armor. But there was none. Dwayne stood there, still and collected, like a boulder in a storm. He didn't need to push back. He didn't even need to speak anymore. His presence was enough to shift the balance of the room. Greg glanced at his friends. Again, but the support was gone. Their faces were pale, uncertain. Some had already begun inching away from the table. The loudest ones from earlier now looked like they wanted nothing more than to vanish. They knew what Greg hadn't figured out yet. This wasn't a guy you messed with, not here, not tonight. "You don't get it, do you?" Greg muttered, his voice lower now, shaking slightly. "I don't back down from anyone." Dwayne's eyes didn't blink. He didn't move a muscle. He just tilted his head slightly, studying Greg like someone studying a decision already made. "Then you're about to find out," he said just above a whisper, that one line, that calm, restrained promise. It landed harder than any punch. Even the bartender, who had been quietly polishing glasses behind the bar, took a step back, sensing the moment was seconds away from breaking. A couple near the exit whispered to each other, deciding whether it was time to leave. Greg felt it too. That slow, crushing weight of a mistake you haven't made yet. But no, you're going to. He had built his entire reputation on being the loudest guy in the room, the one no one dared challenge. But now, he was staring into the eyes of a man who didn't need to yell, didn't need to swing, a man who had already won, because he knew something Greg didn't. When you are the storm, you don't need to raise your voice. Still, pride is a dangerous thing. And Greg had too much of it. It pulled at him, poisoned his better judgment. He clenched his fists, his shoulders twitching with the need to act, to do something, anything to claw back control. But in his heart, he knew he was already losing. Silence in the bar had turned suffocating. Even the air felt heavier, like the whole room was holding its breath. Greg stood still for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides, chest rising and falling faster than before. The tension around, his mouth said it all. He wasn't backing down, not because he was brave, because he was trapped. Trapped by his ego, his pride, and a crowd that had already turned cold. Then without another word, Greg made his move. His arms snapped back, muscles tightening, and in one clumsy, desperate motion, he swung. It was a punch meant to prove something, to reclaim what he thought was slipping through his fingers, but it never had a chance to land, because before his fist even reached its peak, Dwayne had already moved. It happened so fast, most people in the bar didn't even see it. One moment Greg was winding up, and the next, his arm was twisted behind his back, his entire body pulled forward with sudden, brutal elegance. Dwayne had him. Bent over, face inches from the sticky surface of the table, his weight completely controlled. It wasn't violent, it wasn't loud, but it was absolute. A pained grunt escaped Greg's lips. His cocky expression vanished, wiped away in an instant by the sting of his own mistake. His friends stood frozen, eyes wide, unsure whether to intervene or just pretend they'd never known him. Dwayne leaned in, just enough to make sure Greg could hear every word. "You made the wrong choice," he said, calm as ever. His grip tightened slightly, just enough to make the lesson stick, but never enough to break. That was Dwayne's power. Precision, control. He didn't want to hurt Greg. He just wanted to end this and make sure it never happened again. The bar was dead silent. Every customer, every employee, every pair of eyes was fixed on the scene. Greg, the man who had spent the night making others feel small, now looked smaller than ever. All that bluster, all that noise, it had collapsed in seconds. "Apologize," Dwayne said. Greg writhed, trying to twist free, but the pain in his shoulder told him the truth. There was no way out. Dwayne was in total control. For the first time in his life, Greg wasn't holding the power. He was begging for a way to keep what little pride he had left. The bartender ducked slightly behind the bar, watching with bated breath, still not sure if a real fight had broken out, or if he was witnessing something far more calculated. A few of the bar's regulars looked at each other, half in shock, half in awe. No one had seen anything like it. Not here. Eric hadn't moved, still frozen, still wide-eyed. But this time, it wasn't fear that held him in place. It was disbelief. He had never seen someone like Greg get shut down, especially not with such calm, surgical precision. Part of him wanted to cheer. Part of him didn't dare speak, and then slowly Greg's body slumped just slightly, not from pain but from realization. He'd lost, completely, utterly, and there was no one left in the room to save him from it. Greg's breathing had changed. It was heavier now, jagged and uneven, like a man trying to hold together the last shreds of control while drowning in his own embarrassment. Dwayne stood just a step away, having released his hold. He wasn't pressing the advantage. He wasn't gloating. He was giving Greg a choice, a final out. Walk away with a bruised ego, or go deeper down a path he had no hope of surviving. But pride is a stubborn beast. Greg turned, his wrist still aching from the hold, face flushed red with anger and humiliation. He scanned the room, looking for something, support, sympathy, maybe even an excuse. But all he found were blank stares. His friends no longer wore their earlier smirks. The crowd had shifted. The cheers were no longer his. No one was on his side, and the worst part, they had seen it all. With a jaw clenched tight and a grunt of frustration, Greg snapped. "You think you're tough?" he spat, wiping spilled beer. And from his sleeve, like it somehow helped him recover face. "You think this is over?" But Dwayne didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence had more gravity than any comeback could, so Greg lunged. This time it wasn't a punch. It was clumsier, angrier, a two-handed grab, desperate to reclaim some control. He tried to get hold of Dwayne's shirt, tried to turn the tide with brute force, but all he managed was another mistake. Dwayne shifted, just a simple, precise motion, and suddenly Greg's world spun. His momentum betrayed him. One twist, one step, and Greg was slammed, not hard, not brutally, but firmly, back first into the bar counter. The sound of wood against bone echoed across the room. The bartender instinctively took a step back, watching in awe. No one screamed, no one panicked. They just watched, frozen, witnessing something between a lesson and a reckoning. Dwayne had Greg pinned. One hand gripped Greg's wrist, the other pressed gently but immovably against his shoulder. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't violent, it was controlled. A statement, one that said, "This ends here." Greg squirmed for a second, just one, but it was enough to tell the story. He couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't win. And now, with his cheek almost brushing the bar top, with the sting of failure burning hotter than the hold itself, he heard Dwayne's voice one last time. "It's over," Dwayne said. Not loud, not smug, just final. And Greg knew it. His fists trembled, but not out of strength, out of fear and frustration. He'd been put in his place in front of everyone. No cheap punch could fix it. No friend could talk him out of it. His reputation, built on volume and intimidation, had collapsed in complete silence. Dwayne released him and stepped back, not to taunt, not to mock, but because the fight was over. It had never even really begun. Greg rubbed his wrist again, looking around like a man waking up from a bad dream. All those eyes still on him, the whispers starting, the judgment sinking in. He had a choice, and this time even his pride knew better than to push it. Greg stood there, frozen. His chest rose and fell with shallow, frustrated breaths. His pride, once the loudest thing in the room, was now the only thing keeping him from collapsing entirely. He looked around again, but this time not for support. He was just trying to find a way out that wouldn't look like surrender, but every direction told the same story. No one was on his side. The crowd had shifted completely. What once was laughter and amusement at his expense was now discomfort, judgment, even quiet disgust. For a moment, it looked like he might still try something, one last desperate reach to salvage his image. But it never came. The fight in him had bled out somewhere between Dwayne's grip and the stunned silence of his so-called friends. He gave a long, drawn-out sigh, jaw tight with humiliation, and muttered under his breath, "Forget this." He didn't say it to Dwayne. He didn't say it to anyone, really. It was more like a quiet surrender to the room, to the moment, to the truth that he had been outclassed, outmatched, and, worst of all, seen. He turned, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the door without another word. His friends exchanged uncertain glances, but they followed him, heads low. Not out of loyalty, but because the faster they exited that bar, the sooner the embarrassment might stop echoing in their heads. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a beat, the silence remained. Then slowly, a single clap broke the air. It came from Eric, the same man who had been sitting silently, enduring abuse just moments ago, now stood at his table with a faint smile of disbelief. He began to clap. Once, twice. Then others joined, and before long, the entire bar erupted into applause. Dwayne turned slightly, not expecting the recognition. He didn't wave. He didn't smile big, just a small nod of acknowledgement, as if to say it wasn't for the attention. And it wasn't. It never was. He had stepped in because someone needed to, and now the room felt that. Customers were patting him on the back, strangers offering their drinks. Murmurs of, "That was incredible," and "I've never seen anything like that," filled the room like music. Even the bartender, who had remained silent through the whole ordeal, finally spoke. "I don't know who you are, man," he said, shaking his head with a kind of reverent disbelief. "But that was something else." Dwayne gave a modest smile. "Just came in for a quiet drink," he replied. The bartender laughed and slid him a fresh glass. "Then this one's on the house." Around them, the atmosphere was beginning to relax again, but not entirely. The room was buzzing, charged, still processing what had just happened. Not because it had been violent, but because it hadn't been. Because strength had just shown up in its purest form, quiet, composed, unwavering. People returned to their seats, but conversations lingered around Dwayne's name. Some were already retelling the moment in detail, how he moved, how Greg folded, how everything changed without a single punch thrown. Eric approached him with gratitude in his eyes, barely believing the scene he had just been part of. And Dwayne, he took a slow sip of his drink and finally allowed himself to settle. He hadn't just stopped a bully. He'd reminded a room full of people what real strength actually looks like. As the bar settled, something lingered in the air, a feeling no one could quite shake. It wasn't fear, it wasn't excitement, it was respect. Dwayne Johnson didn't just diffuse a situation. He left behind a silence that said more than any outburst ever could. There was no victory speech, no chest thumping, no dramatic exit. Just a man sitting back down, sipping his drink like the storm had never happened. But everyone in that bar knew what they'd seen, and they wouldn't stop talking about it for a long time. Eric approached him, eyes still wide with disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice low, almost embarrassed. "That guy's been coming here for weeks, making people miserable. No one ever said anything." Dwayne looked at him, calm and steady. "No need," he said. "People like that only push as far as they're allowed to." The bartender leaned over the counter, still visibly shaken. "I've seen plenty of fights in this place," he said, "but never anything like that. You could have knocked him out cold, but you didn't." Dwayne gave a half smile, barely more than a shift in the corner of his mouth. "A fight's not always about winning," he said. "Sometimes it's about making sure nobody else has to fight again." The regulars nearby were still buzzing, retelling every move in vivid detail. "Did you see how he moved?" one whispered. "That wasn't just luck. He knew what he was doing." Another chimed in, "And he didn't even hit the guy, he just shut him down." Meanwhile, outside, Greg and his crew were walking down the street in silence. Greg rubbed his wrist, still sore from the hold, but the real damage wasn't physical. It was in his pride, in the way his friends no longer looked at him the same. One of them finally broke the silence. "Man, maybe just let this one go." Greg didn't answer. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew he wouldn't be showing his face in that bar again. Back inside, Dwayne finished his drink, left some cash on the counter, and stood to leave. As he walked toward the door, Eric called out one last time, "Wait, what's your name?" Dwayne paused, turned just enough to glance over his shoulder, and said it with that signature calm, "Dwayne." And then he was gone, out into the night. Quiet, composed, a walking lesson in what true strength looks like, because the truth is, real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to scream or show off. Real strength stands up when it matters most. It steps in when no one else will. It protects, it restrains, and it leaves behind something no one can forget. That night, Dwayne Johnson didn't just stop a bully. He showed a room full of strangers, and maybe all of us, what it really means to be strong. What you just watched wasn't about fighting. It wasn't about dominance. It was about something deeper, about knowing when to rise, when to protect, and when to walk away. Dwayne Johnson didn't throw punches. He threw perspective. He reminded us that true strength doesn't need an audience, but sometimes it inspires one anyway. If this moment moved you, even a little, if it made you feel braver or angrier or just more human, then don't keep it to yourself. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to see it and leave a comment below. Have you ever witnessed real strength like this? And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, real stories, raw stories, then subscribe and hit the bell. Because this is only the beginning. Thanks for watching. And remember, real power isn't loud. It just shows up when it matters most.